I'm joined today by Christof Koch. Christof is one of the world's leading experts in the study of consciousness. He was the chief scientist at the Allen Institute for Brain Science and is now a Meritorious Investigator there. He is also the chief scientist of the Tiny Blue Dot Foundation in Santa Monica. Christof has over 350 scientific papers and has written 6 books on consciousness, including Consciousness, Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist, The Feeling of Life Itself, and most recently, Then I Am, Myself, the World. Christof, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
What is consciousness?
Experience, feelings, seeing. You can see me, right?
I can.
You can hear me,
Yes.
right? You can presumably feel the seat you're sitting on. Tonight you're going to go to bed and sleep, and you will wake up inside your sleeping body, and you will have, again, experiences. They might be different. You don't have a sense of self. You might fly. You might walk through walls, but we call those dreaming, and that's another conscious state. Wanting, loving, fearing, dreading, all of those are all conscious experience. You can call them mental states. You can call them subjective, phenomenal. They all denote the same, this private aspect that only you have access to.
So why is there such a big philosophical question here? Could you tell us about the easy problems and your quest to find the neural correlates of consciousness, and then also tell us about the hard problem?
Okay, so traditionally the heart, the beating heart, as it were, of the mind-body problem is a challenge. How do feelings come into the world that don't seem to have any according to science? So if you look at the foundational equations of physics, quantum mechanics and relativity, there's a priori nothing there about consciousness. Classical physics, Newton, etc., nothing there about consciousness. Chemistry, the periodic table, there's electrons and valence bands and all of that, nothing about consciousness. Evolution, genes, your endless ATGC chatter in your nucleotides in your cells. Again, there's nothing consciousness. So it's unclear how a piece of matter like this, it's, a piece of furniture of the universe, subject to the same laws as everything else in the universe, why certain pieces of matter can love and can hate and can dread and can fear and can see. That's the mystery, and this is this more recently called the hard problem by David Chalmers, but it has a variety of names throughout the ages. This is really the heart of the matter. But we understand, and people admit, there seems to be this relationship. Maybe it's 1-to-1 between conscious states and the brain. Oh, that's a modern realization. Before people thought it was the heart, and people still say, I love you with all my heart, but, it's more appropriate to say, I love you with all my hypothalamus. So we do know there's this close relationship between the brain and consciousness, but why that should be, that is totally unclear. Now, so you can leave that hard question aside for now and just say, well, let's just study the exact relationship, because it's not just the whole body, it's the brain. It's not just the entire brain. For example, you can lose your spinal cord, you'll be quadriplegic, but your conscious experience of the world doesn't change much. I mean, you can't move, you're in a wheelchair and all of that, but you can still love and hate and fear and dream and see, right? You can lose 80% of your nerve cells. They're in this little brain at the back of your brain called the cerebellum. And if you have a lesion there, or let's say a tumor, and the surgeon has to carve out the part of the cerebellum, you look like you're drunk, you became ataxic, you can't do this thing anymore. In fact, that's what's being tested for with a neurologist. So you have various dysfunction, but again, your conscious experience of the world will not be impaired. And so you have to ask, well, what is it about the neurons here in the back that don't seem to be necessary, that don't seem to be involved in consciousness? They are gorgeous. They're, in fact, some of the most beautiful neurons in the brain, so-called Purkinje cell. They have these coral fan-like appearance. They're in the cerebellum, and they don't seem to generate consciousness, yet they have synapses like anything else. They have a map, they have axons, they have neurons, they have dendritic spikes, they have all the accoutrements of neurons. So what is it about the cerebellum that seems to be insufficient to generate consciousness? And then lastly, we come sort of to the outermost layer of the brain that's maximally expand. That's a defining hallmark for mammals, a so-called cortex or neocortex, the new cortex. That seems to be most closely associated with consciousness. But even there's question, is it really the front of the cortex that most people traditionally associate with human superiority, supposedly in intelligence and reasoning, or is it the back of the cortex that's more closely associated with vision and hearing and touching, etc.? So those are all questions that we can investigate. That's sort of more conceptually, some philosophers call it easy. But of course, it's easy. In no apparent way is it easy. It's very, very complicated. The brain is the most complex piece of active matter in the known universe. And so manipulating, studying is enormously complex, much more complicated than any physical problem that science has tackled so far. But this is partly what I do, trying to understand what are the critical the critical substrate of consciousness. When do they first occur? When were you first conscious? Was it when you were ejected through the birth canal or your mom's birth canal into the world and cried for the first time? Of course, you don't remember that because you have childhood amnesia, but was that the first moment, or did it occur later, or was it maybe in the second trimester when you were still, a fetus? What happens if you have a stroke or a cardiac arrest or something, and you're in a clinic and you are unresponsive? Are you truly unconscious or are you just unresponsive? And then how far does consciousness go? Let's say among mammals. What about cats and dogs? Most people who have cats and dogs say, well, of course they're conscious. But how low does it go? Is a mouse conscious? Is a tree shrew conscious? Well, what about other vertebrates like fish, or invertebrates like squid? What about flies? What about worms? What about single-cell creatures? They're enormously complex. No one has ever simulated all the vast molecular machinery inside a single cell. Does it feel like something? So those are all questions that science now is starting to answer, in particular with respect to human and closely related species, typically primates, non-human primates, and mice and rats.
I want to move to illusionism and the meta problem of consciousness, but first, there was a letter that you wrote to Daniel Dennett once when you had to abort a hiking trip. What was that letter about?
Well, so Dan Dennett, who passed away last year, the doyen of American philosophers, he wrote a very well-known book called Consciousness Explained. And as I quipped, it really should be called Consciousness Explained Away, because he is part of a tradition, particularly in Anglo-American analytic philosophy, that finds consciousness so challenging to their worldview, the empirical, logical positivism, that's what it arose from historically in the 1920s, Vienna Circle, that they essentially deny that it's truly in any sense meaningful to talk about consciousness. It's an elusive concept. Either it's an illusion, so there's some people, the illusionist you mentioned, say it's just an illusion. Of course, then it's the illusion that we all have all the time. Everyone has it. And when you don't have it anymore, i.e. when you're in deep sleep or anesthesia or supposedly dead, then it disappears. So and as René Descartes pointed out, this illusion is the only way I know I exist. The only, cogito ergo sum, je pense donc je suis. The only way I know I exist is because I can see, I can hear, I can even deny my own existence. St. Augustine, argued already in the 4th century AD, but in denying my existence, I affirm it. So Dan Dennett was one of many modern philosophers who found consciousness so irksome that he simply denies it. And so at the time I was corresponding with him, and I was a climber, a rock climber in the Sierras, and I had to abort a climbing trip because I had this god-awful pounding, toothache. And in one of his books, he says, well, let's talk about pain. Pain, there isn't really anything, this badness of pain, this quality of pain, that doesn't really exist. What exists is sort of the predilection for you to rub your cheek and to moan and to talk about pain, all the behavior we associate with pain. But the actual subjective feeling, that's an illusion. I said, that is completely bullshit. At that point in time, the most important thing, the only thing, as far as I'm concerned, was this god-awful pain. All right, so how can you say, if you say that's an illusion, then how do I know anything exists? Then all of this is an illusion. Anyhow, so the project of denying or canceling, it's really trying to cancel consciousness. That project has utterly failed, right? Consciousness refuses to be, gaslighting us into believing, well, you're just confused. This is a paradigmatic example of gaslighting, right?
Right.
When somebody explains to you, you don't really have feelings in the way you think you do. That's just all an illusion. You're just confused about it. And once you accept my belief, you realize it's just a big confusion. And as Pat Churchland famously said, in the future, educated people will no more talk about consciousness than they will talk about phlogiston or the Olympic gods, right? Because we realize it's a complete figment of our imagination. That hasn't happened, and I predict this will never happen as long as there are people. As long as they're humans and other related species who can talk and who can express about their feelings, their love and hates and distastes and dreads and fears for the future. And so the entire project of Anglo-American philosophy, analytic philosophy, has failed. Has failed to really come to grips with the central phenomena at the center of our lives, namely consciousness.
Before we move away from illusionism entirely, the meta problem of consciousness, I think, still interests me, because the idea that consciousness is undeniable, like Descartes' "I think, therefore I am," is a thought that is presumably generated by the brain like any other. And in fact, if we became zombies, half an hour ago, we would still be having perfect philosophical zombies, which are creatures that are identical to us atom by atom, but don't have this thing called qualia or experience. If we became P-zombies half an hour ago, we would still have the same conversation. You would talk about the undeniability of pain. And if we move away from illusionism, we're kind of assuming that we sit in some sort of what he calls a Cartesian theater, that there is you sitting in the theater and you're kind of pointing out and you're like, I see a tree, or I see this, or I hear that. Do you think we sit in a Cartesian theater of sorts? And if so, what is the neuroscientific evidence for that? Why does the brain have authority to talk about consciousness, even if it does exist?
Because it's the only thing I know. I don't need a philosopher to give me permission or authority to talk about it. Dan Dennett, just like Sigmund Freud, interesting, Francis Crick made this observation, is very good with words, okay, in all these Gedanken and thought experiments, but science doesn't really work like that, with the exception maybe of special relativity in Albert Einstein, right? I don't know about this and this Cartesian theater. All I know, I'm conscious. It's completely undeniable to me. I have as philosophers say, I have direct acquaintance with the fact of my own consciousness. I do not have acquaintance with your consciousness, so I make an inference that we do all the time in science. I don't access most of scientific objects. No one has ever seen a Higgs boson, okay, never. They infer the existence of Higgs boson because of certain signs and certain, if you look at, if you do the cloud chamber experiment and the accelerator experiment at CERN, you indirectly infer the existence of boson. No one has ever seen a black hole, okay? Because famously, of course, you can't see it, right? Because no light escapes from it. So why do we believe in black holes? Because we inferred using the scientific method. So, I could say, well, per analytical philosophy, none of that exists because it's all inferential. I cannot logically prove it. No, it is true. I cannot logically prove that all of you are zombies and I'm the only conscious person. So ontological solipsism is unprovable. But it's stupid because it would say, well, there's one set of facts that's true for my brain. My brain generates consciousness, but your brain that's statistically very similar to my brain somehow follows different psychophysical laws and doesn't generate consciousness. That's extremely unlikely. So therefore, the inference to the best explanation is all of us are conscious. Right, us and closely related species like other mammals, etc., are conscious, and so as we extend this, who is conscious, we have to be more and more careful. Who do we extend it to? Is the particle conscious? So ultimately, for that, we need a theory of consciousness. No matter what, we need a theory, a fundamental, empirical, testable, scientific theory that tells us which bits and pieces of matter have this miraculous property that they feel like something.
Let's now talk about consciousness. What a lot of people think is that a feeling of being a self, the feeling of I, is something that is inextricably tied with being conscious. For a lot of people, they think that those are synonymous. You had an experience with 5-MeO-DMT where you experienced the loss of a sense of self, but were still conscious. Could you talk about that experience and why you think that it's good to not feel like a self at some points?
So first of all, to claim that, so it is true, many people identify consciousness with really self-consciousness. Yes. Okay, well, that primarily occurs in people, right? Other animals are, there's a mirror test, etc., but they are certainly much less self-conscious. My dog is completely conscious, but my dog doesn't sit there and worry about himself and the fact that his tail may be crooked, right? Dogs don't do that. They don't have the cognitive capacity. Babies, by the way, also don't do that, and even little children don't do that, right? So if we say self-consciousness is essential, then we deny consciousness to babies and pre-linguistic infants. And we would also deny to patients who have lost, who can't even talk anymore because they are aphasic, right? So to me, it always seemed very unrealistic that self-consciousness is a defining feature. Clearly, I can be conscious of myself. I can reflect upon myself. I know I'm going to die. I can think about the world where I'm not around anymore. All of that is true, but it just seems it's one particular aspect of consciousness. When I see, for example, this blue here, I don't see why myself has to be involved. Now, some philosophers have what's called HOT, higher order theory. They always think it's always self-referential, but this doesn't make sense. And partly, I now know it doesn't make any sense because, as you alluded to, I had an experience where it's the most astounding experience of my existence, where within 3 breaths, literally within 20 seconds, you inhale 3 times, and then there's and the last thing I saw was this black smoke. And then my entire visual field, my entire plenum sort of dissolved into black hexagonals. So I remarked there were hexagonals, and then sort of this black hole opened, and everything was swallowed up. And then my last thought was, holy shit, what have I done? Because I thought, well, gee, I'm actually going to die now. And psychologically, that's what happens. You die. And then you come through, whatever remains of my conscious experience comes to be in a place where all of space seemingly, it's very difficult to describe, but so as best I can describe it is all of space seemingly had collapsed into a singularity, in a single point that was incredibly bright. Very, very bright. Some people call it the tunnel, the tunnel of light and all of that. I don't know, because tunnel implied there's space around it. I'm not sure there was space around it. All there was very bright, icy, cold light. There was nothing else. There were no other features, no space, no time. This event wasn't too short or too long. It simply was. And there was no color, there was no depth, there was no left, right, up, down, there was no pain, no pleasure, no sound, nothing else. And there was no Christof, there was no self, there was no external world. So people who looked at me from the outside said I was there, I was whining and with eyes wide open, but you're completely disconnected from the world. So you don't experience the world, you don't experience your body, there's nothing there. There's no memory of Christof. There wasn't a child or man or woman or a god or anything. There was just experience, terror, 3 things. There was a bright light, terror, and ecstasy. And so that's how I know, again, from direct experience, I've direct acquaintance with such a state that is not quite contentless, because there are these 3 distinctions, but very minimal and certainly no self in any way, shape, or form.
And you write in your latest book about why there's value in that sense of being a self, that feeling of I not being felt at all times, that there's parts of the day where extinguishing that, albeit temporarily, can be a good thing. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so I compared with, we all live in the gravitational field of planet Earth. We can never escape that. Rarely when you, for example, in a flotation tank, you can float, or when you're an astronaut, you can become weightless, right, for a few hours or so. So similar, you sometimes can become egoless, selfless, and I think it's in states where you certain states of meditation, when you're completely in the flow, right? When you're doing, I used to be able to do this when I either did math or programming, when you're so involved with what you're doing that everything else cedes, and including, the sense of self, it can very quickly reassert itself, right? As soon as somebody touches you or calls you, you can snap back, but if they don't, you are in this state of flow, or when you run, I row, or climb, you can get in those states, or during certain psychedelic states. And I think they're very beneficial because, of course, our life, particularly as we get older, is dominated by the sense of self. And in many people, the self is aggrieved, and it's all about ego and ego satisfaction. Everything revolves around me, and me. Right? We're attracted to. We live on planet self. Right? We live in this gravitational field of the self, and everything is about us. And of course, that also can be very negative, right? Where you're totally obsessed about yourself, and either you belittle yourself or you aggrandize yourself, and you always reflect, well, what do they think about me? And everything is then about the self. Can be highly dysfunctional, and people are very unhappy. And so, escaping that tyranny of the self can be beneficial. We need the self, right? So, you're now getting your master. At some point, you may get your PhD. So you have to work for many years in a very disciplined manner. And for that, you need a sense of self. And why am I doing this again? Why I'm going to grad school rather than making money and enjoying myself, right? So the self is necessary, but it can also be a burden to carry. And so losing that self, suddenly you realize the world is amazing. So if you ever go on a magic trip, right? You realize where the self isn't totally gone, but it's heavily reduced, right? One of the great features of magic trips are that you can get totally lost in the foliage, and you can suddenly see the profound beauty of the world without the self being there. And then you realize, even if I'm dying, even if my self is gone, well, the beauty still remains. It's still this beautiful universe, and it can really be uplifting. So in my case, just practically speaking, I realized, and this was completely unexpected. I hadn't expected that at all. A few weeks after this experience, this loss of self and the entire world, of course, is completely disruptive, utterly terrifying. And there isn't a day, it's happened in the first week of the pandemic for me, there isn't a day I don't think about it. And so at some point I realized what I haven't thought about is fear of death. So as you get older, much older than your sleep isn't as good anymore, and you often lie in bed, unable to sleep, and you think about what will happen after you're dead. And it can be very, very dysfunctional, right? It's like standing at an abyss, on a climb, and looking down this canyon to this abyss, and the abyss has no bottom, and you get this existential vertigo, and it's a very uncomfortable feeling, and of course there's nothing you can do about it, right? Ever since this experience, I never had that experience again. I know I'm going to die. I don't want to die, but I've just completely accepted it. And turns out, then I did literature search. It's not an infrequent occurrence after such events that people can lose their fear of death.
I've certainly had glimpses of selflessness, and I found those to be quite relieving and liberating, at least temporarily. What I was curious to know about your experience is why you felt it shook your ontology, and that you have been a neuroscientist for many decades, but this gave you real things to think about and grapple with when it comes to explaining consciousness. Why did it do that? Why did it not just feel like you had one of many conscious experiences, and we're going to find out what the neural correlate of being on 5-MeO DMT is at some point? Why did this have an effect on you beyond that?
Okay, it's a very good question. So not that experience. So that experience, it taught me that the self isn't necessary and that space and time are construct, as, Immanuel Kant, Transcendental Idealism, I said it 200 years earlier. It did not really it shook me psychologically, very much so, but it didn't shake my metaphysical foundation. There was a different experience, which in fact is the title of this book, that happened 2 years ago now, on a beach late at night under the southern sky, 2 a.m. or something, on a beach, under different circumstances, where I lost my body, my sense of self. You could feel it coming on. You get this piloerections, it's called, when your hairs on your back sort of stand up. You get this overwhelming feeling of awe, and you lose your sense of self. And I had this what's called a mystical experience. I felt I was identical to the entire universe. I mean, whatever remained of me, again, it wasn't Christof that was identical. It was just whatever remained of me in that circumstance felt being one with the universe. And that really shook me because so my evolution of my metaphysics is, so I have to step back a little bit. I grew up in a devout Roman Catholic family and practiced the faith. My own children were baptized Catholic, but then progressively lost it. Now, of course, the dominant feature of Catholic faith is dualism. In fact, Cartesian dualism, right? There's a body, okay, and including the brain, but then there is this what Descartes called res cogitans, thinking stuff that only we have, famously not animals, that causes us to think and to be rational creatures. That we are somewhat similar to the Aristotelian soul, but explicitly meant to be non-materialistic and, of course, immortal. And after a while, being a scientist, I lost that. There is no evidence. And of course, if you have this dualism, you always have this problem that was already pointed out to him, when he wrote about it in 1648 in his correspondence with the Princess of Bohemia, I think, because she pointed out, well, if this is this ephemeral cognitive stuff, if it interacts with the res extensa, the material stuff, how is this soul supposed to stir the waters of matter, right? So that causal interaction problem, that's always been the Achilles heel of dualism, and so I lost that. But then now suddenly, the experience I had seemed to reveal, seemingly, if I take it at face value, and in a sense I have to, because this experience, as William James talks about it, has this noetic quality, it has this authority over you that you feel, okay, I know what the world really is made out of. It's all phenomenal. It's all mental. That's the only thing that really is. Not only is your experience and the only thing you access, right, in the world is phenomenal stuff, is mental stuff, right? You don't access really a table. All you access is, if you knock this table, you can access you see it, so you access it through visual consciousness. You hear the knock, so you access it through auditory consciousness. You can feel the knock, so that's somatosensory. So we only access the world through phenomenal stuff, and then we have to infer, well, what analyzes really physical stuff. Right? And then you throw out, modern world has sort of, worldview has thrown out all the mental stuff, and then you just are left with the physical stuff, and that's really classical physics. But now you have this experience, no, the only thing that fundamentally exists is just mental, and somehow the physical stuff has to arise out of the mental, the phenomenal. And then, of course, I remembered as an adolescent, I read The World as in Willis Representation, Arthur Schopenhauer, Idealism, and then there's a modern philosopher called Bernardo Kastrup, who's essentially a modern Schopenhauer idealist, called Analytic Idealism, and then sort of I felt, okay, this is it. It's idealism. Idealism is the right metaphysics. Then, of course, the challenge is, well, I admit, and because I'm still a scientist, I'm employed as a scientist, I do scientific experiments, so by all those measures, I'm a member of Neuroscience Society, so by all those measures, I'm a scientist, and it is true that by far the best method people have invented to manipulate, best in the sense of being able to predict things and manipulate things, right? Magic doesn't work, no other form of manipulation the world works as reliable as science. That's why all cultures, whether you're an Atollah or Indians, etc., or Chinese, they all adapt science because science simply works. And I admit that. But the thing with science is science itself is neutral with respect to what ultimately exists. If you don't take the claims that some scientists make about what truly exists, if you don't take that seriously, just say, well, scientists are very good at postulating things and manipulating them. And that works exceedingly well, and that's true. And I continue to do it in the lab. But what truly exists may actually only be mental states. And somehow you have to explain how physical states arise out of mental states. And you also have to explain the other challenge is, if everything is mental, Well, so why don't I know what you're thinking? Why don't I know what why don't I have direct access to your consciousness, right? If it's all just a universal consciousness. So there is this problem of dissociative boundaries that under normal condition, I don't access the universal mind, the cosmic consciousness, and I don't even access your consciousness. So how is that?
One of the previous guests we've had on the podcast, Professor Stone Addington, talked about how an issue with a lot of the discussions on consciousness is that a lot of the arguments come down to conceivability. When you have an idea like illusionism or epiphenomenalism, some kind of dualism, idealism, sometimes you kind of get off the ride, like say, as you did for illusionism, saying, no, that seems like nonsense to me, because you can't conceive of it, or other people can't really conceive of p-zombies, like Dennett, for example. Idealism is really interesting to me. You've been flirting with it a lot for the last year. You've talked to Bernardo Kastrup, and you've tried to push him a bit on idealism. And then you also talked to Anil Seth, where he tried to push you, and you tried to defend some aspects of idealism. But for me, the conceivability issue for idealism, which I would like to know your thoughts on, is why is it that the brain seems to be so central to it, which is, according to Kastrup's idealism, the brain is just what conscious experience looks like to other people of other people from the perspective of consciousness. And it's not just that it looks that way, but it's also that during some neurosurgery, you can stimulate different parts of the brain and make them feel certain desires, feel certain emotions, remember specific things. So it's such an organ that you can even manipulate it such that you induce experiences. In your journey with idealism, where do you feel like you're at right now in terms of what you've accepted? And how do you make sense of this, which is, why does the brain seem to be so important in experience?
Well, so it's so important for us on this particular planet, being subject to this particular evolution. It might be very different on different planets that have radical different evolutionary history, or in non-planetary environments like in the sun, or on lone planets that don't have a central stellar companion like we do, where life may have to evolve in an ocean of liquid hydrogen, right? It's just on this particular world. With us, consciousness seems to depend on brains. We still don't know to what extent are non-brain creatures that don't have like certain plankton that can assemble into these very large pseudo-colonies, right? Does it feel like something to be them? They don't have a nervous system. What about plants that famously don't have a nervous system? And we simply don't know at this point. Are they conscious? Does it feel like something to be them? I simply don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no. We don't know. So it's just in us. If we make ourselves, again, the omphalos of the world, then it's, of course, once again about us and our species or closely related species. But that may just be this particular outcome of this particular evolutionary history on this planet. So I don't know whether that's truly central. It is true that consciousness seems to be associated, and certainly per integrated information theory, seems to be associated with these very, very complex system, but it's not quite clear why, for example, not your liver or not your heart. That's also a very complex, by any measure, organ. Why doesn't the heart feel like something, or the liver feel like something? We don't know. We think because it's less complex, but that's sort of an intuition. We don't really know that right now.
Yeah, I want to get into integrated information theory, but before that, I want to press on this a little more, which is, why is it under an idealist monist perspective, like the one Schopenhauer Kostrup has, that it's not just that the brain seems to be correlated with conscious experience. It's not just what it looks like from the perspective of experience, but rather impacting the brain, with chemicals or through an injury or accident, also seems to affect consciousness as well. Do you have any sense on how idealism could possibly account for that?
No, I mean, there's no question. This is what I do. Last week, I had a long debate with a neurosurgeon about that very fact. You can stimulate very discrete points. For example, there's a beautiful paper 2 years ago by a neurosurgeon, a colleague of mine, that removed the feeling that induced in a 14-year-old girl that had these episodes of intense feeling of guilt, a very Catholic emotion. And then it turned out, after imaging, there is a little tumor that was growing in her underneath the anterior cingulate, under the genu. And once Itzhak Fried, the surgeon, put an electrode there and stimulate, he can induce because you do this while the patient is awake, this intense feeling of guilt. And then he removed it and removed these episodes of guilt. So here you have a very high level social emotion that seems to have a particular locus in the brain. And that's true. How that should happen no, I don't know. And I don't have any firm, I admit I'm confused, because physicalism works to a certain extent very well. However, physicalism has failed to explain consciousness, and physicalism has the second challenge that we don't actually know what the physical is. It used to be very easy before 1900 in a classical physical universe. Physical is stuff, right? Atoms, obviously. But then quantum mechanics came in, and now we're really confused about what truly constitutes stuff, right? So, we get these Schrödinger cat illusions. Well, that's really weird. And now we get, ERP pairs, right? Entangled, you can take two pairs of entangled photons, you can put them half a universe away, and you look at this, you interact with this, and instantaneous, independent of the distance, that determines the state of this. Well, that's certainly not my grandma's materialism anymore. This is really weird stuff, right? This is really weird shit. And this is supposed to be the best description we have of the universe, where things are entangled independent of the distance. And, mechanistic, we always think, well, there must be a force. Well, but there isn't a force. If there would be a force, it would violate special relativity, so we don't like that. So somehow, mysteriously, magically, they're linked. Well, So, in fact, I'm now organizing a conference with physicists, with foundational physics and philosophers, including Bernardo Kastrup, to discuss to what extent can some of these idealistic ideas be reconciled with what today modern physics teaches us about things like entanglement, which is truly a mystery that physicists haven't really understood. And the curious thing about that is there's this metaphysical school, hardly a school, but interpretation, shut up, in quantum mechanics called shut up and calculate, right? If you don't worry about the metaphysical consequences, you just use Schrödinger's equation, you collapse, the wave function, whatever that may mean, you get some of the most exact measurements. They were just confirmed this week again with the magnetic moment of the muon. So you get the most accurate results, agreement between experiment and prediction in any science. But once you say, how can this be in this universe? What are the mechanisms? Then you get into great difficulties. And so the question is, can idealism resolve some of those and thereby answer the first problem? How does, what about consciousness? And then explain these mystical experiences, these states where people insist. And of course, it's not just me. It's many people who have had these mystical experiences that typically count among the most meaningful experiences of their life, including, by the way, Richard Wagner. So this title comes from the second act of Tristan and Isolde by Richard Wagner, where, of course, on stage, they express this mystical feeling where they sing jointly. Tristan and Isolde, they become one, and jointly sing in German, selbst dann bin ich die Welt, then I am myself the world. So how do you explain this common experience, common in history and across cultures?
Let's talk about your scientific theory of consciousness that you've been an advocate for a while, which is integrated information theory. I'll start by saying that the stakes are quite high for having a scientific theory of consciousness. As you've pointed out, once we have this theory confirmed, we would be able to know if someone in a coma is really conscious but is just unresponsive. We would be able to know which animals are conscious and to what level they can experience the world. We would have a bit more answers for artificial intelligence or other types of computers like neuromorphic computers. We might even have really good painkillers because we would understand the exact correlates of the brain that correspond to the experience of having a toothache, for example.
In principle, yes.
In principle. What is integrated information theory?
So it's a scientific theory of consciousness that starts with consciousness. So there are two approaches when we talk about scientific theories as compared to metaphysical speculations about materialism, physicalism, idealism, panpsychism, dualism, all of that, right? So now over the last 30 years, there's a bunch of theories that have emerged, although many people say they have a theory, but what they really mean, they have a hunch. They have a hunch, I think quantum mechanics is involved. Well, that's not a theory of consciousness. Right? A theory is something where you start with a few axioms, just like in relativity or in chemistry, and then try to explain from a very small number of foundational principles, you try to explain many phenomena. So IIT, and IIT is distinguished from most theories. IIT starts with consciousness. So it says, what are the key defining properties of any conscious experience, no matter how construed, whether it's an experience of a baby or child or a human or an animal, whether it's an adult or whatever. Every experience exists for itself. That's what it means to have an experience. It's specific. It's something like right now, there's a specific experience, right? Sitting here, seeing this, hearing the audience and all of that. It's definite. It's not indefinite, unlike, for example, quantum mechanics, where you can get superposition of two states, right? When you have an experience, whatever it is, even if it's very vague, you're driving, let's say, at night through fog, it is the way it is. It's all foggy now. It's one, it's integrated. It's not two separate experiences. Not that I have this left experience and the right experience and there are two experiences. No, there's one experience that may have visual components and auditory components, and I might feel the chair at the back of my body, etc. And it's only one. It's not many, it's only one. So you take those 5 properties and say, okay, so every experience, no matter how bizarre, will satisfy those will satisfy those axioms. And then together, you need one further step, which is to say you need a measure of what exists. So this theory is pretty fundamental. The person who constructed this, really, its chief architect is Giulio Tononi, an Italian-American psychiatrist, neuroscientist at the University of Madison in Wisconsin. And he has a fundamental principle of existence. What exists, this goes back to Plato, what exists has to have causal power. How do we know anything exists? It's a general question. Well, in science, we know it exists because we can measure its influence. So we think, for example, that dark matter exists, famously. Why? Well, because it seems to exert gravitational attraction, right, on the distribution of the stars in the galaxy, in the large-scale distribution of galaxies. The matter we observe doesn't seem to be enough. We need this invisible matter, which is called dark matter, which doesn't interact with light, but which has gravitational. Well, so there we search something exists like dark matter because it has causal power over, in this case, normal matter. So something exists for others if it can make a difference or take a difference. If it can make a difference to the world and it can take a difference to the world. And IIT applies that precept to any system themselves. So a system exists for itself if it can make a difference and take a difference. What that means is it is in a particular state, like my brain, and it's influenced by its previous state, its past. It's not random. It's not like a random collection of things that randomly, because let's say they're in a thermal bath, randomly they are. Because if its system is truly random, it has no causal power upon itself. It's just subject to random fluctuation. So the brain is a system that can be determined by its own past and can determine its own future. And the extent to which any system has causal power, that is what consciousness is. And so it has this mathematical apparatus to define causal power in a rigorous way. You give me a system, you give me what's called its probability matrix, right? So the system has these states, these n states, and from these n states, with some probability, it can transition to those states, right? Standard in computer science. Once I have such a probability distribution, I can then compute the intrinsic power of the system that the system has upon itself. Then the theory says there are two aspects about that. One, I can get a measure, a single number. It's a number called phi, the Greek phi, integrated information, which can be zero. Then the system is reducible to its part. It doesn't properly exist as a system. Only any systems that have phi different than zero, that are positive, can't be negative, that are positive, exist for themselves. The bigger this phi, the bigger the system is conscious, the bigger the system is irreducible, because it's more than the sum of its parts. It's both highly differentiated and highly integrated. So that's a measure of consciousness. And then what the system is conscious of, the theory says, it's all the causal powers of these neurons acting on those, and those 10 acting on those 20, and those 7 acting on those 15 over there. So it's a vast combinatorials. It goes super exponential. So if you have n, let's say, neurons, the possible states of this is 2 to the 2 to the n. So it's vast beyond imagination. And the theory says that is the intrinsic causal power of a system in a particular state that maps one-to-one onto its conscious experience, such that nothing is left over on either side. So it's an identity relation. It doesn't say it has to be the same. It's just that everything, intrinsic power, maps onto a phenomenal aspect, and every phenomenal aspect has a corresponding in intrinsic power. So it's very radical, because most other theories of consciousness, they start with the brain. They say, well, the brain has short-term memory, or the brain has a global workspace. And then you squeeze very hard, and you squeeze the juice of consciousness out of it by saying, well, anytime information enters in the global workspace, it becomes conscious. Or anytime there's a collapse of the wave function, it becomes conscious. But then you always have to ask, well, what is it about the collapse of the wave function? Or what is it about the global workspace? If I just broadcast information, does it become automatically conscious?
So why is IIT not also trying to squeeze the juice out of consciousness out of this thing called intrinsic causal power? And maybe you can first talk a little bit about what intrinsic causal power is defined by.
Well, because it starts with consciousness, by the system's complete probability transition probability. It's TPM, transition probability matrix. It starts with that. It says, remember, it says consciousness exists. In fact, it talks about this central chasm that separates conscious things from non-conscious things, that runs through everything. If you're conscious, you exist for yourself. You exist for yourself, and you know that because you are conscious. You can think, you can reflect upon that. Tonight, in the first part of your sleep, you're going to lose it. You will not exist for yourself anymore, because you're in a part of the sleep called deep sleep. You exist for your bad partner. He or she can see, oh yeah, your body is there, but you don't exist for yourself anymore. And then you wake up inside, later on during the night, you might wake up, or you will wake up inside your sleeping body, and you'll dream. Then again, you exist for yourself. During anesthesia, you don't exist for yourself. Supposedly after you die, you don't exist for yourself. So absolute existence really it's really conscious existence, and everything else is relative existence. The sun, it's a huge body, can burn us up instantaneously, but only exists for others, at least so we think. Most of the physical things exist, but they only exist for others. They exert causal power on others, including us, but they don't exist for themselves. Only conscious things exist for themselves.
So I understand that IIT uses different terms, and it certainly makes it, gives consciousness primacy, as you say. But it still seems to me that there's still a magic step that happens, even if you were to call this an explanatory identity. When I'm looking at a transition probability matrix, or I see the phi value of a specific system, that's still not communicating to me the qualia of the system. So does IIT...
That's correct, because you never have direct access to... it may be different once you merge brains, because then I think you can have states where your consciousness becomes one with the other. But no, because that defines as the subjectivity. Subjectivity means it's personal to that system. I don't access it.
Okay. My confusion with IIT is that when we assign these axioms, when we assign properties to consciousness like unity and definiteness, isn't that already shifting the discussion away from consciousness itself to what appears in consciousness? In other words, if you were to say consciousness is unified, what you really mean is the feeling of unification appears in consciousness. In fact, the only way you know that your experience at this time feels unified or structured or definite is that you're consciously experiencing that feeling.
Well, let's put it differently. I cannot imagine what it would be to have a conscious experience that's not definite, or that's not specific, or that's not unified. And so to me, it seems a basic feature based on an intuition, I grant you, that this cannot be mathematically derived, right? There's no mathematically, logically unassailable proof that leads from some fundamental axiom to saying, well, it has to be like this. But it seems those five properties exhaustively define every conscious experience. Now, you could add other. You could say, well, most experiences occur in time. Right? Most of the time, we experience the flow of time. That's true most of the time, but then there are these special things like in flow or during high psychedelic dose when the passage of time ceases. You can say, well, a defining characteristic is it's always about me. There's always someone looking out. But again, then there are special experiences where that doesn't seem to be the case. But I cannot conceive of an experience that's not specific. It's not definite. That's not unitary.
So I want to press on this a little bit more.
But I mean, ultimately, it's a scientific theory.
Yes.
So it means it has to be tested. It can be wrong. It's in principle very easy to disprove. If the physical substrate is not the maximum of causal power, then the theory is disproven. So it's a scientific theory. It's not a matter of, I mean, it has, of course, association. It has consequences, but it's empirically accessible, and the only way it can really be tested is in us. In fact, any scientific theory has to be tested in us because we're the only subject, ultimately in the limit only me, where we are sure that we're conscious.
The reason why I'm concerned about that intuition being fundamental for generating these axioms is if we had, for whatever reason, only evolved to have the sense of sound, right? And we didn't have any other qualia, seeing, touching, tasting, smelling, or, other experiences we can have, we would then think that consciousness must have, these would be maybe three more axioms you'd add: tone, pitch, and volume, as fundamental axioms to include in IIT. And I would say, do you really think that's necessary? We could maybe have experiences that don't have that. But you would say, I can't conceive of an experience that isn't constituted by those things. So I think maybe how I'll try to bring this back is maybe IIT can determine what is it about systems that constitute human-like experiences that are constituted by the axioms we have. But the concern is, how do we know this can actually extrapolate to other things like animals or other computers?
Again, this is an empirical question, so we have to, it's by inference to the best explanation. Why do we think that whales are not fish?
But I think what I'm getting at is...
So we have to do the same thing. We have to test, okay, so let's go to a non-human primate. The brain is very similar to us, right? It has the same senses to first order than we have. So it's relatively easy to infer that. Now, if we go to a squid, now already we're talking, maybe sometimes it has 8 brains, and are they dissociated or are they one? Is it like a super magnified split brain patient? Not just 2, but 8. So it's an inference to the best explanation. So it makes it vulnerable, as you want it to. It makes it vulnerable to empirical falsification, because if it can't be empirically falsified, then it's not science. It may be sound metaphysics, but it's not science. And what makes science different from philosophy is that ultimately you have to rely on empirical tests. So that makes something like a creature like IIT different from something like idealism or materialism that cannot be tested in that manner.
Though, as you pointed out earlier, we don't have access to each other's or other animals' subjective experiences. So if this intuition of these must be the basic axioms that we're hunting for conscious experience, and we're going to figure out, how much intrinsic causal power a system has, let's say IIT, continues to make some more breakthroughs. It's already had some pretty significant ones. We'll talk about the adversarial collaboration, but IIT is really able to fully explain all the neural correlates of consciousness in humans. The question is, how is it even in principle testable when we are talking about creatures that aren't humans or computers of some kind?
Just like theory of relativity it can be tested in very extreme circumstances that Einstein did not even conceive of, like black holes, right? If you make the right extrapolation and the theory is sound, yes. So my claim is, if you discover that so for instance, let's take bees. I used to work with bees. They're wonderful creatures. They have 1 million neurons. That circuit density is 10 times higher than our circuit density. They are capable of very complex behavior. They have this waggle dance, right? They can communicate food sources and quality food sources and where they are. They can recognize individual beekeepers. They are highly social. In fact, they're eusocial. So it would not surprise me to find, and this is a prediction, that they most likely have, because of their architecture, relatively high phi. So then I think that means that it would feel like something to be a bee, and they have certain properties that you can then test. Which particular modalities do they have? What is the structure of their, what's their microphenomenology? Because again, IT makes some very specific prediction, not just this system is conscious or this person is conscious, but in principle, what are they currently conscious of? Whether that's a person where you can ask, or a bee where you have to do sort of experiments to find out what is the bee experiencing. Yeah, I think it's possible, or even in very non-standard system, maybe some non-evolved physical system, right? We assume consciousness is only associated with highly evolved system like us, but it may well be possible that there are extraordinary systems out there in the universe, like, superconducting oceans of liquid helium far away from any central star, that may well have very complex cellular-like structures that may well feel like something, and we can in principle access that.
The good thing about IIT is that it makes very concrete predictions. Could you tell us about what IIT has gotten right so far, and also talk about the adversarial collaboration with the global neuronal workspace theory?
Yeah, so it's still in its infancy, and it has been criticized, and this is correct, for it's very mathematical, which many people, particularly in biology and psychology, don't like or aren't used to. And it's non-trivial to compute because of this combinatorial explosion. As I said, if there are n elements, phi can grow as rapidly as 2 to the 2 to the n. So that's prodigious. So in practically speaking, right now, you can only explicitly compute causal power for very small system. Of course, the same criticism was made in physics in the 19th century, before the advent of computers, right? That most of the stuff that physics derived in thermodynamics simply wasn't computable. Now it's a little bit more computable, but even quantum mechanics, typically when you do ab initio calculation, really using Schrödinger's equation, you're limited to a very small system, because any realistic system like this simply cannot be simulated, and so you have to make all sorts of assumptions. And so that's one criticism. Where it has been, it explains a number of very puzzling facts. So for instance, why the cerebellum isn't conscious, but why the cortex seems to be closely associated with consciousness. What happens at sleep? In sleep, my cortex doesn't dissolve into soup. It's still basically the same structure. But it's suddenly, particularly when you have these very slow crisscrossing waves during deep sleep, you lose consciousness. So it explains a finding like that. It has led to the design and experimental test in several hundred patients now of a consciousness detector. So here we're talking about patients who had cardiac arrest or hemorrhage or traumatic brain injury following an accident. They come into the ICU and they don't respond. They have what's called Glasgow Coma Scale, very low, 6 or 7 or 8. You ask them, sir, can you hear me? Can you track this? You pinch them. Can they do they withdraw their hand, or do they orient towards a painful stimulus? Many of these patients don't. 10,000 of them, in fact, don't. And then what happens in this country and in Europe, after 3 to 5 or 6 days, the medical team will start talking with the loved one and will ask, is this what she would have wanted? Is this what he would have wanted? And in 70 to 90% of the time, they decide no, and they withdraw ventilator support, and the person dies. However, we now know that on average, there was a big article came out last year in New England Journal of Medicine, because it was so important, made it to the front page of the New York Times, that shows that roughly 20%, 1 out of 4 of these patients is covertly conscious. So in other words, they are conscious. We don't know to what extent. We don't know whether they have a full mental life or whether it's restricted, but we know they're conscious. We know for it partly because we can see they can voluntarily, on command, modulate sometimes their brain activity. If you ask them, for example, think about closing your hand for 30 seconds, and then think about opening your hand. And you do that number of times, and then you can see, you put an EEG or you put them inside a magnetic scanner, and you can see brain activity in their motor strips sort of go up and down with that. So we know that 25% of these patients are conscious. So we need a practical tool that tells us this patient is conscious and this patient is not conscious. So that's an unmet clinical need. And IIT is the first theory that came up with such a test. It was first published in Science exactly 20 years ago. IIT makes some very unusual prediction, which makes some people rather uncomfortable. Among others, it has certain panpsychist leaning. It's not panpsychism, but it has certainly. So it would certainly not say that that everything is conscious. So, for instance, it may well be bees are conscious because of the complexity of the brain, but IIT, for example, doesn't claim that the beehive is conscious. Because it's always about the trade-off between if you add more. So IIT says very precisely, conscious, the physical substrate is the maximum of cause-effect power. So if you take, for example, a bee and it has a local cause-effect power, right? It has high complexity, high intrinsic causal power in what's called the mushroom body inside the brain of a bee, which is, roughly like 2 by 2 by 2 millimeters, something like that. But then if you go across 2 bees, there the integrated information is vastly less. Same thing with us. You're conscious, no question. I'm conscious, no question. There's a local maximum of causal power here and here. But if I look at the combined effect of us two, even though we interact, there is some causal interaction. You ask me a question, I reply, etc. That causal interaction is dwarfed by the causal interaction, let's say, between the left and the right brain. So I can well imagine a future technology like, Neurogate, Neuralink-like technology where our brains are starting to connect, where at some point, if I add more and more wires between my brain and your brain, you will not be conscious anymore, and there will be no more Christof. Instead, there will be this Ubermind, this combination of you and I, but one mind speaking with 2 mouths, having 4 cortical hemispheres. So it makes some very precise prediction, but it has some leaning. Also, it may well be true that single cells, or maybe some of those plants we see out there, may also feel like something. Lots of people, particular scientists, don't like that. But that's not, just because it makes these ethical. So that means we might have to enlarge our remit of what is conscious. It may be far larger than we think it is. And so be it. It also has been attacked on the ground that it's anti-abortion because it makes claim that maybe a fetus is already conscious. Well, again, if that's true, I can't sort of not accept that theory is true because it makes some ethical implication that people are uncomfortable with. That's not a good scientific criteria for choosing a theory.
Let's move on to another topic. I want to talk to you about free will. I'll make a very simple case for why I don't think we have free will, and then you can tell me about how you would want to rescue the concept. I've come to realize that everyone has a really personal relationship with the question of free will. For me, it's something that I never really believed in, even when I was a kid. And it kind of came from the observation that if you're angry or frustrated at someone and you're given an explanation for why it happened, that anger and frustration cuts down. And once you get more and more context, it seems to often fade away entirely. Not to say that those emotions don't have value, they're very important, but it kind of clicked for me that if you were to have a full explanation for why someone did the thing they did, you had the full movie of their life available to you, then that gap that you hold in your mind for the explanation goes away. So the case for why we don't have free will is just either everything is based off of cause and effect all the way down. If we were to rewind time to the Big Bang, the exact same things would unfold. Or things happen not because of cause and effect. They happen because of quantum randomness. They happen because of divine influence, because of something we have no idea about. But in that case, basically by definition, I didn't control for those things. That is the simple reason why I think we don't have free will. Why do you think we do?
I'm sorry to hear that about you.
Why?
Because you deny yourself agency. And I think a lot of the crisis in the modern world, the anomie that people have, is that they feel they are left powerless. They're all these subject to these anonymous forces. They can do anything. Well, and by the way, I don't even have free will. So I'm just this little cog driven, tossed about by fate. There's nothing I can do about it.
I don't think so. I think for me, the fully understanding that there's no free will was a much more recent thing, and understanding the implications of that. But I think it's actually been the way you've described selflessness. I think this has been equally liberating in that you don't feel synonymous to the next thought that appears to you. You can kind of
so you can do anything you want because you're not responsible.
No,
for your
I think
action. You can go out and steal something. Why? It's not
no,
me.
because
it's my fate. I'm just determined by it.
So there's a difference between fatalism and determinism, but putting that aside, we can still make intelligent distinctions between actions that were voluntary and involuntary and still hold people accountable. In fact, if it is true that
voluntarily,
voluntary,
what's the etymology of voluntary?
So voluntary,
volutus, will.
Right.
And you deny there is no will. So
no. So here's
everything is involuntary for you.
No. We can still say that some actions we are associated with the intention of wanting to do that action. This is something I learned from you, which is that there is a circuit in the brain responsible for the feeling of authorship associated with your actions, right? So actions can be voluntary, involuntary, and we can tease those apart, and we can explain that this person, or we can still make inferences as to people's subjective experiences about whether they intended to do that or whether that kind of happened beyond what we would deem to be a sense of control. But that changes nothing about the truth or falsity of determinism. And I would add that if determinism is true, it's always been true. So we've been, you can live, if we've been living moral, happy lives under determinism, we can continue doing that once we accept there's
But of course,
no
in the modern world, it's characterized by a rising mental crisis, and people are very unhappy.
Not believing in free will is responsible for that?
I think it's one aspect of many. Okay, but leaving that aside, so determinism has never appealed to me because we know from quantum mechanics that for instance, the distribution of galaxies, the signature of galaxies is randomness written in the sky, because at the Big Bang or just before the inflation, they occupied such small volume, right? Per Heisenberg, they had to adopt this random position that got gigantically amplified. So pure determinism has never appealed to me as a physicist. But of course, you can say, well, it's not it's random. That doesn't make it much better, and that I do accept. It depends on your ontology. So remember, IIT starts with consciousness first and foremost, and ultimately what truly exists for itself, and that's intrinsic causal power. And so ultimately, the paradigmatic, freely made decision within IIT is, I come to a decision in the road. I come to a fork in the road. Okay, and there are two possibilities, let's say in the simplest case, A or non-A, okay? And I deliberate A consciously. This is all happening in my consciousness. So per IIT, this could really only happen in, let's say, people. My dog doesn't have that freedom because my dog cannot clearly conceive of two different scenarios, A and non-A, and then you have the reason and what are the consequences, ethical or otherwise, from doing A or for doing non-A. And then you in that sense, if you can clearly imagine those two scenarios, then you freely choose one. And I think that is classical libertarian free will. Now you can say, well, but you can see, you might be able to see, correlates of that in the brain, like a famous experiment by Ben Libet, leaving aside the minor objection that the Libet experiment really has no morally meaningful consequences. The Libet experiment is very famous, where he got a person to, they put EEG sensors on the subject, and there was a clock that went around, and people were told randomly, whenever you feel like it, you raise your hand. Okay, so it's not a moral, meaningful decision, but it is a decision. And there they could show, yes, a second or up to 1.5 seconds ahead of time, you can see what's called a readiness potential that arises over prefrontal cortex. But what do we teach our students? Correlation is not causation. Correlation is not causation. Yes, of course there are going to be correlates in the brain, but that is not the true cause. The true cause is your consciousness, because that's where true existence lies. So it really has to do with the ontology you adopt. If you adopt standard materialist language, then either everything is determined or it's random, which doesn't make it much better. But if you take a different point of view, like IIT's point of view, what truly exists fundamentally is and only what truly exists is consciousness, then these decisions, if they're really made in this reflective mode, are freely taken decisions. So it's not a compatibilist interpretation.
Yes, yeah. There's a lot there, so I want to track to some of those points. First, as like a general framing thing, I don't think that we should directly attach, an inherent negative valence to giving up free will, because you were able to give up the sense of self.
You remind me so much of that. And then it's okay not to believe in consciousness. Okay. The world is still beautiful, okay. Right?
Right. Which is, if
you're just denying, you're just trying to explain yourself why it's okay not to be free.
It's okay to accept that.
It's okay. I don't want to make you feel bad.
No. I in fact take the Dan Dennett thing as a compliment. I think he was fantastic, maybe wrong, but still a great philosopher.
That's what really matters. Are you right or are you wrong?
I think I'm right, and I'll explain why I feel that is.
Of course, you have to say that, because it's predetermined. That's the difference. I can freely make this decision.
When you, for example, educated us earlier about giving up the sense of self, right? In that moment when you were on 5-MeO-DMT, there was no Christof. The feeling of self is another feeling that appears in our conscious experience. The feeling of authorship is another feeling that appears in our conscious experience.
It is but it's a real thing. This is not a Buddhist. This is not a Buddhist point of view.
No
it's
denial.
All illusion, right?
No, of course. I don't at all think that consciousness is an illusion. I think it might be the only thing that's real. I don't know if there's anything beyond that. But there's no denial of our lived experience. Our lived experience also does not include free will, because if you just observe your thoughts just with meditation or even a few moments of introspection, you realize that they're generated entirely on their own. You can't, and this is an idea that Schopenhauer kind of hinted at, you can't know the next thought you have until it enters your conscious awareness. And on the point you made about how correlation is not causation, I do want to talk about the free will study, or the free will paper that you published with Tononi, and about how your ontology matters here. But in some cases, we can start to understand that, in at least the view that we traditionally take, when the brain is responsible for what you do, the study you mentioned earlier from Itzhak Fried about the tumor pressing on part of the brain that was responsible for guilt, we're not going to look at that and say, actually, correlation is not causation. We remove the tumor and we see changes. When Phineas Gage had a rod go through his head, that did not affect the posterior hot zone, I believe. So he's still conscious, according to IIT.
He was still conscious.
Yes.
Not controversial.
Phineas Gage, uncontroversially, was conscious. His behavior was modified, right? He started acting very rude. He was just not himself. Especially, I'm surprised to hear
if you
this.
give me drugs or alcohol or,
Yes.
or point a gun at my head, yes, I'm not free.
Yes, absolutely. So they're all the way down, it seems that the brain is, at least in some sense, making us do what we do. If you impact the brain, and this is especially because you point out very rightfully in your book that intelligence is different than consciousness. You talk about how AI really is, we're building more and more intelligent systems. That's not the same as consciousness. So when we have Phineas Gage, for example, or more traumatic accidents that one could potentially have, and they do, bad things, we say that they don't have free will because there's this thing that modified the deterministic or the clockwork or whatever goes on in the brain that made them do what they do. But now if we were to remove that rod from Phineas Gage's head, or if that were to have never happened, it's still the case that the brain was making them do what they do. The tumor is making someone feel guilt, or if it presses on their amygdala, make them do all sorts of horrible
I
things.
guess I hear you. I would beg to differ. I would say, I mean, there are some people when you read, which can be gut-wrenching, the evil things they do to other people, particularly innocent people or children, but they don't have a tumor, at least apparent, or...
So does that birth something magical that they now escape what their brain... And I'm not saying that we need to remove responsibility.
No, but in a normal brain, in a normal neurotypical brain, people can conceive of scenarios, if I do this or I don't do it. Most people can do that.
Yes.
And therefore, under those conditions, when you have a relatively normal brain that can do that, then per IIT and certainly also by the law, you act when there isn't anything that can directly, explain why you did your heinous crimes.
For a lot of things, right? Like if someone, did something and then we saw the tumor pressing on their amygdala, as we've seen in a case of there was like a shooting, we then are like, okay, we see them as, this cause and effect, and this thing really messed with them. It's unfortunate. When we have that, we don't have that for evil. I can't look at an fMRI and a brain MRI and tell you, okay, there's this thing for evil. Once we are able to do that, and we have pills for evil, and people can actually take them, and if someone forgot, we see them, as a tragic case. Would that not change your intuitions on this subject once we have the cure for evil?
Well, no, because I think what happens in evil, they precisely want to be evil. That's a point, of course, right? And they take joy
in
but let's say this pill would disable,
this pill would decrease the craving to be
evil.
Yeah,
of course. Once in the worst case, if you put them in a prison, they can't be evil anymore. Yeah, so if you totally change their brain chemistry or something, change the brain chemistry, they'll say, what? No, I don't want to hurt anyone anymore. Yes, you can do that. And in fact, chemical castration, so for instance, right, used to be... in this country, in other countries, people, if you're a rapist, for instance, or Alan Turing, foundational figure, right? He probably committed suicide because he was ordered chemical castration, because he was charged under the Homosexuality Act in Britain, okay? So, of course, that changes your brain chemistry, right? And then you're less likely to do certain acts, yes. But, again, that's correlation.
The pill would, if someone were to have taken the pill, we would say that would have caused, when we talk about pills and tumors and things that affect the brain, we no longer are like, well, magically there's correlation. We do see those things as causation in some sense, right?
No, in that case it is, because now you have an external causal power, in this case a drug that affects something in your brain circuit. But I'm talking about a brain that's not subject to that, where all there is the extrinsic causal power, right? Everything is subject to either external causal power. Look, if I jump out of a tall building, I'm going to fall, right? Why? Because the external causal power of gravity. There's very little I can do about it, right? Because that power is overwhelming compared to my ability to resist gravity by holding on to the windowsill, right? So there's clearly external power that can totally overwhelm the internal causal power. But if that's not the case on a more neurotypical condition, then I think the brain can primarily act on its intrinsic causal power. Again, if you point a gun at my head, then there's this external causal power. So it's a trade-off between presence of external causal power or internal causal power that finally accomplish the action.
Your defense of free will is not a compatibilist one. I think there are a lot of important questions of free will, which is, should we still think we have free will, or should we use that term to apply to cases where you have a normal brain deliberately making decisions? Should we just call that free will?
I think we do in practice.
Yes, those are. There are a lot of great arguments for that, but that's not the one I want to get at, because that's not the one that you're.
And the language, as I said, when you say voluntary, volutus comes from Latin will, and so that implies...
There's no denying that there's will. The question is, where did the next thought or intention, or when I'm trying to deliberate on a decision really carefully and I'm fully conscious and everything, there is as I said earlier, you don't know the next thought that'll occur to you until you're aware of it. Where it comes from could be deterministic clockwork, or from the devil, or from quantum mechanics. But it is true that whatever decision I make during the deliberation, the four parts you break it down into in the paper of, deliberating, reasoning, and then doing the action, there's no reason to think that something magical or different happens when we don't have, a very obvious thing like a tumor or a rod sitting in the brain. And throughout that process of deliberation, we can still probably find the neural correlates of.
Oh yeah, in principle,
right,
yes.
in principle. And
but
so
those are the correlates. That's not where
it's not causation, but we do know. We would say that if someone was knocked in the head or has a tumor, that's what caused them to act in the way they did.
In that case, it's an external.
But when
causation,
we take it away.
Yes.
There's maybe
it's
a different
powers. That's exactly what the brain does. Yes,
right.
That's exactly because the brain does have this intrinsic power. It's always subject to extrinsic power, no question. But when those are removed under ideal circumstances, it is the brain that's the underlying substrate. But what really was the cause was another intrinsic experience within that stream of consciousness. And so you can assign it to that particular entity, this causal power that unfolds, the system that has this experience and now unfolds in time, from a starting point to an end point where it makes a decision, then executed. That system, in that sense, made that decision freely.
There's a lot to get into. I want to try to stay mindful of your time, but I'll make one more point and ask.
Can this be tested in any satisfactory way? Or do we? Because ultimately, any test, I'm not sure this can be. How could this be tested? I'm just talking to myself here.
Test what?
Well, how could this be tested?
Libet tested it. Itzhak Fried tested it as well.
Yeah, there's no question that correlates. So I guess
yes.
How can you go beyond empirically? Can you go beyond the correlates? I'm not sure you can.
Have you heard of the hungry judge phenomenon study?
Yeah, in Israel, where for clemency, right? Where judges that were asked for clemency, if they do it before lunch, they are much less likely to give clemency.
It's not just much less likely. The number one best predictor for how harsh the judge was going to be, controlling for everything else, was how long it had been since they last had eaten. And in fact, once they had a break and they went back to making decisions. And I think that that's a good example of a good demonstration. It's not an argument for why we don't have free will, but it's a demonstration of how we can still accept determinism, even though we have consciousness, whatever you want to call it, intrinsic causal powers, that even when we're consciously deliberating and we're highly qualified, intelligent judges, it is still all the way down. It seems to be cause and effect. And if it's not.
Okay, so I would really the study sounds a little bit too facile. So
I think the authors, when they reanalyzed it, they made a convincing case for why it wasn't. But it has been replicated when we.
But I'm willing to believe it.
Sure.
I think your basic point is valid. There are untold, unconscious influences on our behavior. How I vote can be largely explained by my parents.
Yeah, right? The zombie agents that you and Crick wrote about.
Yeah. That's true. My social economics class where I live, the zip code where I live explains a lot of variance. So I would say many of those decisions are less free than we think they are. But per IIT, there are certain decisions when you really deliberate that are free. So I think ultimately we just have to differ. And ultimately, in this case, it's a metaphysical question, because you can always say, well, there will be some correlates, and I agree with that. There will always be correlates, but I would say they're correlates and not causes. So it has to do with your power ontology. If you really believe that causal power ultimately, and you accept the existence of causal powers, then I think it's a natural way to think about free will.
Yeah, I want to move to the last question.
I freely decided that I have free will. It makes me happy.
I think about the paper that you and Tononi wrote. I think it sneaks in this definition of existence when you say words like irreducible, self-causal power, and then it even says that neurons, in this sense, in this ontology, don't exist. So when we have this whole phi structure, which is the only thing that truly exists, and only what truly exists can cause, as you've said many times, it basically, I believe it's somewhat of a trick of language, which is that you're then shifting it to what really exists is this intrinsic causal power. Because it's intrinsic causal power, by definition, it was free. But as a conscious being, that still doesn't change my experience of the world, which is that the next thought that occurs to me entirely on its own. The next intention, the next thing that you feel, I'm going to prove this kid wrong, this is what I'm going to say, that just occurred to you probably right now. It didn't occur to you a second earlier, and you didn't even know that it would occur to you then. So even if we fully buy IIT that there's this thing called intrinsic causal power, now you've maybe knocked on determinism. Maybe consciousness does something weird to determinism. It's no longer deterministic. It's generated through this
that's
intrinsic causal power.
So there is a theory by Eccles and Popper, right? That
yes.
they exactly believe that.
Which you, I think, are against because of the energy conservation.
Yeah, it's unlikely too. It's unlikely. You can't rule it out, but it's unlikely. Yeah.
Yeah. I do want to move on to our last question, but I will quickly say that I don't think giving up a belief in free will is necessarily an awful thing, because just the way you pointed out, you should feel like a self most of the time. You can still feel like a self most of the time. There's nothing wrong with that, but you can still accept that, this is like an optional feeling that your brain generates, and having moments throughout your day where you don't feel like a self can be wonderful. I think the same applies to free will, and it certainly helps with building, more compassion, with more self-understanding, with, better understanding yourself. So I don't think that it should necessarily be colored in a negative light.
It may not have to be, but I do. So, you mentioned this foundation, Tiny Blue Dot. Our aim is to minimize suffering. And so we, commission studies and talk with people. And it's clearly over the last 20 years, this predates COVID, predates even the rise of social media. There's this ever increasing malaise with the world, global, anxiety, particularly among, your generation, young people. It keeps on rising. And I think there are many factors to do that: social media, lack of autonomous play, etc. But one is also this narrative that we grow up that we're all subject to these anonymous forces. There's very little we can do about it, and I think it makes people less autonomous and ultimately less happy. It may not have to. I agree with you if you think about it properly, but most people don't think about it properly. Most people don't think about it like the Stoics did.
Do you not feel that there's some kind of relief that you find in seeing, if we take anxiety, for example, in this kind of view that I'm getting out of, you're this conscious being and things appear in your consciousness. You're not, you no longer feel synonymous with your inner monologue or the next desire that you put it there, right? As you educated us about, the feeling of self. And in fact, that's why I was pretty surprised by your argument, because if there is no Christof, as you learned on that trip, who has the free will? But going back to the anxiety point, I think, do you feel like there's value in this idea of, if you just see yourself as a conscious being experiencing things, including the next thought, including a feeling of anxiousness, right? As someone who can get pretty anxious quite often, something that's certainly helped for me is that I don't feel anymore all the time that I am anxious, and I feel anxiousness is another appearance in my conscious awareness, just like a whole lot of other things. And just like how it's appeared, it'll go away, and I can still kind of bear through that. Do you not feel that it has some value here?
Yes. So distancing yourself from the self in this way, right, can be very valuable. In fact, that's one way how people try to teach people that are anxious to just distance themselves from the anxiousness. They are not identical to the anxiety. But I think many people are not capable of doing this step. I don't know. I always was very happy with the thought that I'm the agent of not all,
Captain
but
of
many
of
my actions.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where the point I was making about the self, which is you should feel like that most of the time. You shouldn't not feel like a self, throughout your day. Because as you said, how am I going to plan my life if I have completely relinquished the sense of self? But there are moments when we're trying to, say, not be as angry or not be as anxious, when we can kind of recognize that, things.
I do recognize that, including my own life, many of my actions that are, caused by unknowable, unconscious. So you particularly realize this, and when you ever come into long term, when you, let's say, separate, when you're together with some other and you separate, or you feel guilty, you have an affair or something, you wonder, you question yourself, and you have an endless conversation with therapists and others. Why did you do what you did? And, knowing all the consequences. And it's because evolution didn't give us, as you point out, I guess, indirectly, evolution doesn't give us access to some of the parts of our decision-making apparatus. But then what's the adage of Western philosophy? Know thyself. Know thyself, right? Written over the gates in supposedly at the academy in Athens, and over the temple of Apollo in Greece. Know thyself. And so I think that's one of the ultimate goals of being a philosophical minded person, to try to better, and this is a project you can do till the day you die, always try to understand better and better, why did you just do that? So I went to a Jesuit school, and Jesuits have this daily examination of conscience, where you try to think what I did do, today, and why did I do that? Why did I say this thing to that person? And did I mean it, or what were the true causes? And the idea is just reflect, to try to get at them, to try to understand yourself better, to try to make conscious what's not conscious. Because as you point out, many things are unconscious, but not all things. I simply don't buy that all things are unconscious. And you can try to surface, if you do work with yourself, you can try to surface some of these subterranean thoughts and make them visible to yourself.
I think we're somewhat in agreement on some points, even though we'll defer with the ultimate takeaway in that I for sure don't think that everything is unconscious. I am no illusionist by any means. I think there are consciously processed things, whether it's an epiphenomenon, whether it trails behind brain activity, or whether it really, as your paper suggests, shakes things up and does things differently than the rest of the universe, which might just be deterministic clockwork. Fully willing to buy that. But the historical idea of free will, which I think we should be careful not to redefine, of just there being this central ego-like thing, this self that chooses the next thing completely independent of previous circumstances, is kind of where I get off the ride, because I feel that is unproductive. And I think that the know thyself is still compatible without a belief in ontological free will. And in fact, it might even help, because you're more likely to be able to better analyze, whoa, where did this anxiety or where did this thing come from, right? As opposed to just feeling that you are synonymous with your inner monologue, or
but just because I claim your free will doesn't mean you have to be identical to your thoughts.
Yes, that's why I think free will is actually being redefined. If you were to, even though you're not attempting to be a compatibilist, I think when you say that these intrinsic causal powers are what give us free will, you're no longer describing the thing that we always believed of, I am this, free self that can do things independent of my circumstances. What you're describing is that consciousness makes strange things happen, that it might change, everything in the unconscious world might be deterministic clockwork, but we as conscious beings, something different happens in terms of how our next thoughts or emotions are generated.
No, wait, but it's not like suddenly when I'm conscious, there's some extra magic pixie stuff that makes me.
But even if there was,
and the physics is always exactly the same. The physics is what it is. It's just consciousness, because consciousness, the way it's thought about or defined or explicated within IIT, that is what truly exists in this absolute sense. So I think it's just maybe it's just a reframing. I don't know.
I would love to talk about this more, but I want to round this out with the last question, to be mindful of your time. Tell us about how studying consciousness for so many decades has shaped your own life philosophy. We've talked about free will, but maybe there's other aspects of this as well.
For once, 20 years ago, I turned abruptly into vegetarian. What's really interesting was, after a journalist, so we talked about, this was early days when consciousness, so when I started, I worked with Francis Crick. It wasn't really acceptable for scientists, particularly for someone who hadn't yet obtained the holy state of tenure, to talk about consciousness. And so, but I did. And then a journalist interviewed me and says, we talked about animal experiments to test consciousness. And out of the blue, she says, so you think that this monkey is conscious and the mouse is conscious? I said, yeah, definitely, no doubt it. But you still eat meat. That really perturbed me greatly. But the taste of meat is deeply ingrained. I'm German American. It's a heavy meat, heavy cuisine, deeply ingrained. And so it took the death of my beloved Nosy, a black German Shepherd, in my arms. She was dying, and I was totally distraught and crying. And right there and then, as she was dying in my arms, I decided to honor her. I would never touch meat again. Because why? Purely for ethical reasons, because they can suffer. In particular, if you look at modern animal husbandry, right, industrial scale. It's really atrocious if you watch movies. There's a good reason why taking movies is illegal in this country. If you take a movie of a slaughterhouse, you're committing a crime. And there's a reason, because if people see these, most people have natural state of disgust when they see this anyhow. And so that's one practical consequences of studying consciousness in people and in closely related species, that we are all in this together, whether we are a dog or cat or charismatic megafauna like orcas or whales, or whether we are less charismatic like a snake, or like all these creatures are conscious to a smaller or larger extent, and we should respect all of them. That's probably the biggest ethical implication. We need to reduce the suffering of all, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, we need to reduce the suffering of all creatures and not just humans.
I've really enjoyed our conversation today. It's been an honor. Thanks for coming, Christof.
Well, thank you very much, Josh. That was very engaging.
Yeah.
Particularly around free will. Thank you.